All right, we'll be getting started here in about a minute at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So hold tight and we'll be right back. Looks like we have a number of people that are still working on joining. Let's see, five or six just hopping in right now. So I will hold off for another minute or so before getting started. All right, we'll go ahead and hop in. It is a couple minutes after 11, which is our scheduled start time. So thanks everyone for joining us here today. We'll be going through the data layer, testing and validation. It's a part of our series here. We'll be going through a number of different webinars on putting together, architecting the data layer, testing the data layer with using Tag Inspector. And now I just want to go through more of a holistic view of everything that you'll need for testing the data layer, what that process looks like, how you can actually take a look at values, variables, timings, all that, and then how we can use a couple of different approaches in order to automate the ongoing monitoring and ongoing validation of the data layer. Make sure that everything's available as it should be for the various different tags platforms that you're using. So to start off, just general housekeeping about Tag Inspector and myself, Lucas, your presenter here today. As always, these educational webinars are brought to you by Tag Inspector. Tag Inspector is a product of InfoTrust LLC. On the InfoTrust side of the house, we do web analytics, tag management, as well as product development, working with hundreds, thousands of sites on an annual basis and supporting those annually. A number of different educational endeavors, including these various webinars and then training programs, have a couple of different offices. And as mentioned, I am your presenter today. My name is Lucas. I'm our Tag Inspector Product Manager and also do tag management consulting for a number of clients here. Just to run through a quick agenda of all the things that we'll be covering here today. First, just want to go through a high-level overview, just review what exactly the data layer is, what the overall process for testing and just general tag management process looks like and where this fits in. Then I want to get into the documentation that we'll need. Both one, documentation that you should be putting together already as a part of the overall tag management process as you're going through an audit, testing, and general implementation process for a tag management system, as well as for all various third-party tags that you're implementing on the website. We'll go through what that looks like. I'll even take a step back and kind of go through how exactly you can go about creating that, and then the different documentation that'll be really helpful as you're working on moving through and testing that data layer implementation, and some key things to look at. We'll go through how exactly to test and access the data layer. I want to go through a couple of different approaches. One, just manually checking, which is something that you'll probably find yourself doing more often than not, because it'll just be either one, during the configuration of a tag, needing to make sure that what you need is there, potentially also creating some different variables or macros within your tag management system in order to be able to reference the data layer. So we'll go through how to manually check, the process to go through, and how you can reference different things there. And then we'll also get into some of the automation for testing variables with a couple different approaches. One, you can set up a collection point yourself, as well as being able to use an automated tool such as Tag Inspector in order to be able to take care of that for you. I want to go through some important considerations to consider and to think about as you're testing tags, as well as the data layer, and then some validation at scale. At the end, we'll go through a general summary and answer any questions that might be out there. But as always, I encourage questions to come through as we're going through the presentation here. Always leave a little bit of time at the end, but if there's questions while going through the actual content, more than happy to focus on those items specifically and answer those questions as we're going through here. So please shoot them. I'll be monitoring the questions pane throughout the webinar and happy to take a little bit more time on any topic. Perfect. So to start here, just a general review, high level, what is the data layer, what is the function, what's included, and we'll go through an example of what a typical structure might look like. The example I'm going to use and examples I'll use throughout are going to be primarily geared towards Google Tag Manager. But regardless of the data layer structure that you're using, be it a UTag object for Telium, be it a data layer for Google Tag Manager, concepts, testing, the process is all going to be the exact same. So first, what is the data layer? What is the functionality? It's really summed up perfectly by that visual there that you see on the screen. That is coming from our friends at Telium, which is a tag management system. But the data layer is just an application layer that's sitting in between the front end of your website and the back end. So it's a central place where you can pull all relevant information from the various back-end systems, be it your content management system for things like page content information, be it your e-commerce system for product information or around product ID, product SKU, product price, transaction revenue, transaction IDs. And the data layer is just an array. Technically, it's an array of objects that sits there on the page, not viewable to the user, and is one central place that you can then reference for all your tags. So what's included within a data layer, typically from a structure standpoint, is exactly that: content information, page name, page type, page category, anything that you might be using, one, that you need to collect within a tag or for a platform in order to provide some additional context about that user's behavior, as well as information about the content or about the site or the page type that is going to help you in conditionally firing a particular tag. In the case of an e-commerce website, you're going to have some different tags that should only be firing on, say, product pages, or certain events that should only be firing on product pages, or certain user interactions. That context needs to be there within the data layer so that you can bake that into your firing rules and the triggers for the various tags on the site. Typical structure, as I mentioned, the data layer is a JavaScript object on the page, or rather it's an array of different objects. So it's going to be page information, product information, as well as events, all being pushed to that same object that's there on the page. I want to get into and just be able to provide an example here. So this is the example of a data layer array. So you see here 6 different individual objects, all from various data layer pushes that happen on that particular page. You can see there in that first object, you have all of the different product information for this is an example from a product display page. So you have contextual information about the page, the user, as well as product information. You have some different timing events that are sent there, as well as other events that are going to help for, again, conditionally firing different types of tags. So this is what the data layer is. This is what it looks like. You have your values, you have your variables, and then you have the values that are what's going to be pulled from the back end in order to be able to populate those different items so they can be collected and used by the different tags that are on the website. Perfect. So now that we've just covered just a general high-level review of what the data layer is, how it's functioning, why it should be there on the website, I want to just go through one common theme about what we've been talking about recently has been around the tag management process. So we've gone through this in the context of a number of different topics here in the most recent Tag Inspector webinars. And primarily what we're going to be focusing on here today are steps 2, 3, and 4, and then a little bit for that actual validation or monitoring cycle there on the end. But when it comes to testing and validating the data layer, first we need to understand what are the requirements. What should be there? What values, what variables do we need on these different pages in order to make sure that we have a sustainable, solid tag architecture? In order to understand what should be there, we need to understand the requirements. Now, in some cases, if you are in this case, you're in a lucky situation. You might be in a situation where you already have that documentation. You understand, okay, these are the different tags that should be on the website, these are the data requirements, and then have that translated into an overall data layer solution, basically document. So you know exactly what you're testing against, you know what you're looking for, you know what you need. In many cases, in most organizations, you don't have this yet. And that's where you come in with, starting there at step 2 with the tag audit. We need to understand what tags are on the website, what are the requirements for each, and then we need to translate that once we have a policy for what should be there and what's required. We can then start beginning to create that architecture, and the foundation of that tag architecture is going to be the data layer. Because again, it's the central place that all tags that you have on your website for the purpose of tracking anything you're managing within your tag management system, everything's going to reference that data layer for the various data points that are needed, both for firing rules as well as for contextual information, dimensions, metrics, that sort of thing, that are going to be collected and then sent up to the various platforms. So that's where the focus is going to be. That's how it fits into this overall process. And then obviously once we build those requirements, we have them, we can just test, we can adjust whenever anything new is necessary or any changes happen, and then we can validate and just be alerted when things break. So I want to introduce just the general testing process. I touched on it a little bit there in terms of the general documentation that we're going to need. We're going to need the requirements. We need to understand what tags are there, what are the data requirements for each, what do we need for each of these different tags, and then translate to that into requirements that we have for the data layer. Once we have those general data requirements, we know what should be there. We then need to start thinking about what is the structure that is necessary. What sort of timing do we need to have in order to best manage and best optimize our tag deployment? We then need to start thinking about those individual variables, values, what kind of nomenclature is necessary, how do those key value pairs begin to start matching up, and then we'll get into overall monitoring. So how can we monitor this moving forward? Some automated testing that we can do just to make sure that nothing ever breaks. And when inevitably things do, we can be alerted and know exactly what broke, where it did, and when, so we can fix any issues as soon as they happen. So the first key in this whole process is that documentation piece. We need to, again, understand what's there, what's required of the data layer, what's required of our tag management architecture in order to be able to validate and test against that and make sure everything is there as necessary. The first piece of documentation, it's what I've been referencing, is your overall measurement plan. We need to have the data requirements for each page, each event. In that example data layer that I showed, as you saw in there, you have user information. Is it a guest? Is it a logged in user? Any sort of a user ID or a guest ID so that you can start stitching data from different platforms together for an individual user. You need the page information. You need page name, category, subcategory, section, so that you can use those different values in order to conditionally execute tags on different sections of the site. We need product or content information. What product is actually being viewed, what content, what articles, what authors are actually being viewed, as well as events and interactions that we need to track. Are we wanting to track certain scrolls or impressions of advertisements on a page or of certain products on, say, a listing page? If we're needing to track those things, we need to have that documented so that we can make sure that those events are actually being pushed to the data layer. Or is it something as simple as we want to track certain interactions with the website that we're saying are micro or macro conversions, be it a registration or a transaction or just a form download on the website? What are those events? What are those interactions? What does that look like? And then finally, for each of these different items and for the events and interactions, we need to know what data is necessary in order to be able to collect for each. All of these different things are what's going to come together for your measurement plan. It's going to start out as just a long list of things that need to be collected on each site, or on each page for each tag, and then we can begin combining it together and really condensing that down into our root architecture. So step one in this process, as mentioned, ideally you have a measurement plan. So you can go ahead and begin implementing that and translating that into a data layer. In most situations, you're not. So step one of the process, as mentioned and as you saw in that tag management process, is going to be a general tag audit. We need to know what is loading on the website in order to be able to define what the requirements are in order to sustain that overall architecture. So first, we can just do a general tag inventory. This is an example of something that we put together using Tag Inspector data, just a list of the different tags that are on the website that you're able to then go through, and your business users are able to then go through and identify, okay, what should be here, what shouldn't be here, what's required, what should be removed. Once you have that list of this is required, this is allowed, these are the pages that these different platforms and these different tags should be on, that's when you can then define and understand what are the requirements for those various tags on those various pages. And that's what's then going to inform that measurement policy or that measurement plan. So it starts here, high level, understanding the different platforms and tags that are on the website. Now, I wanted to provide a concrete example of this. Interestingly, I had this whole presentation put together, but this morning, actually, was working on a similar process for a client. So I just wanted to go through how I worked through this actual process and how it looks to give you an understanding of how you can go about it yourself. So first step is identifying the tag list. So in my example here, was going through and identifying the different tags that were necessary for a migration for a mobile specific website. So understanding what were the tags that were going to still be executed on this version of the website as opposed to the desktop. Working through with the business units, we're able to identify Criteo, Facebook, Hotjar, Crux, Pinterest, the conversion tag, and then the Tag Inspector real-time tag as the things that should be or required to be executed. Now, working through these different implementations, and some of you might be familiar with some of these, starting to identify, okay, some of these tags, yes, they just fire across every single page. That's super easy. We don't really need too much in the data layer in order to be able to execute those various tags. And the functions that they're running, what they're doing on those pages really takes care of itself. In some of these other cases, there are specific events and specific aspects of the implementation that need to be executed only on certain pages. For Criteo, it's the home page, it's your listing page, it's your product pages, the basket or the first cart show page, and then your transaction. For Facebook, there's a number of events that you could have configured for Facebook, but the key ones in our situation are all pages, product views, add to carts, and then conversions and purchases. Same thing with Pinterest. And then for Hotjar, Crux, and Tag Inspector, all of those were just across all pages. So starting with an understanding of these are the tags that I need to have on this website, and then going through, okay, where do these different tags, where should they be executing, and writing that out. So you can see here in row 16, all pages, category list page, these are the pages where these things will be executing. So across every single page now, looking at the implementation requirements and the data necessary in order to be able to execute these conditionally, as well as collect what's necessary for that platform, I can then start filling in the blanks. So on every single page, I need page information. I need page type, page name, and a hashed email if logged in, just so I have some sort of a unique identifier that's anonymous for users so that we can start doing some integration on the back end across platforms. On category list pages and on subcategory list pages, I need product IDs that are listed. Product pages, I need ID, name, category, price, add to bag, product ID, product name, product price, cart view, same thing. And then on order confirmation, I need that key product information, as well as transaction ID, transaction revenue. So I'm able to just map out very simply, based upon what I know about these different tags, exactly what's necessary in order to be able to, what's necessary for these different tags. I'm then able to take this information, kind of distill it down. So these are the different variables that I'm going to need to include. And then for each of these different pages, for each of these different events, this is how it looks. In some of these cases, an example. I can then take this and work through with their development team in order to be able to say, okay, I need these data points on these particular pages. I need everything to be in this particular structure. And boom, we have a little bit of collaboration later. We have an overall measurement plan. And I know exactly, all these things can be and have to be in the data layer. And I know that everything's going to be available that I need for the various different tags that are going to be firing and executing on that website. That's just a little bit of insight into the process there. But that's how we go about determining the requirements for each of these different tags. Here's what that final result in just a little bit of a cleaned up version. What we were just looking at, it was more of a scratch pad as I'm actually going through the process. But here you can see the data requirements, list of required data points. And again, this would be for a particular page category where we can identify, okay, these are the names of the different data points that we need, translated there on the far right into this is what the data layer variable is actually going to be for that particular data point. I'm also going to have my list of overall events. So what events, what interactions are we tracking? And then also including in here what type of contextual information, what is the data layer name, what is the contextual information that I need with each of these different interactions. As we saw, again, in that previous example as well. Once I have that, and basically at the point that I was with that spreadsheet that I showed you, I can then get into actual creation of what we call an implementation guide. So what this does is outlines exactly the variables. Now that I have those defined, I know what data points I need, I know what the variable nomenclature is going to be. Defines that as well as the structure. So again, going through what is included in here, we have page information, page type, category, user information, user type, logged in status. I have any sort of custom data. It might be events or other content information. And then I have my product content information. The other key thing that is really important here when it comes to the implementation guide, and it's going to be extremely important when it comes to testing, is the structure. So what we have here, and this is an example code push, but it would be the data layer equals, so we're defining what exactly it is. Again, it's an array of objects, so we're saying that it equals, and what's at first going to happen on the page as soon as the data layer, that object is defined. It's going to include all this page information as well as all this product information. Now, what's important here is how everything is structured. So we have the data layer array of objects, we have an original array, and then we have our e-commerce object. Included within that e-commerce object is our purchase object. Included within that purchase object is our action field, and then our products array. So structure matters, and it matters because of how you're going to be referencing these different variables and being able to pull out these different values from the data layer when you're using them for your tags. Now, I don't want to get too technical here in this particular webinar. We'll have some in the future where we will do more of a deep dive into how this should be configured and what all this should be looking like. But I guess high level here, what you need to know is structure matters for translating, and then is also for testing. Now, one important note here, a lot of times the structure of how things are going to be formatted within the data layer is going to be informed by the tag management system that you're working with, as well as the web analytics platform that you're working with. So this example here that you have on the right is a Google Analytics Enhanced E-commerce example. And you have that e-commerce object with the purchase object, the action field, the products arrays, is all of that structured in such a way because if using Google Tag Manager and using Google Analytics, as soon as you have the data within the data layer in this particular structure, all you have to do is enable one thing within a template tag within GTM, and it's automatically going to capture these different values from these different variables to be able to be sent up to Google Analytics. So it makes it extremely easy and sustainable from the actual tagging standpoint and the configuration of those tags. And it informs how we're putting everything into the data layer and that structure that's being used. Now, I can still reference things like that product ID, product name, product price, that's within that products array for other third parties. But the macro or the variable that I'm setting up within the tag management system to reference that particular value is going to be changed slightly due to the structure of how those are getting there. But this would be what the implementation guide would look like, and this is what you would use then for the testing, for the validation of the data layer itself. Again, getting into just what we need for testing, the documentation, we have all that, the guide, the requirements, our overall tag policy. Once all of that is defined, basically we're just going to be using that implementation guide in order to define exactly what the structure should look like, what variables, what values are going to be required on each different page. Now we can simplify that for the purpose of testing by just segmenting out the data requirements by each page and section, using writing out what the naming conventions need to look like, as well as value specification. So what is revenue? What does that mean? What does that variable, what should it be named? Where should it be within that structure? I should then also have a list of events within my testing documentations. And so when I'm manually going through the website or using an automated process, I can say when this happens, then this should be contained within the data layer. This event should be pushed, this event should be present there, and then this additional context about that event should be included as well. So basically what I'm doing is translating my architecture specifications into some testing documentation. Here is just an example of one of these that I've put together in the past. So as you saw, basically within that implementation guide, you have certain variables, certain attributes that are going to be embedded within others, is the easiest way to explain that. So you can see on the transaction page, we have our top level information, page type, category, user ID, user type, all that. And then embedded within that, we have our purchase object, embedded within that action field, embedded within that products. So for each of these different pieces or parts of the data layer, I have defined what the variable is. I have defined the structure that it should be in. And then I have some documentation that I can work through as I'm going through and actually manually taking a look at this. So when I'm going through and testing and validating, what I'm looking for is, one, these variables to be present within the data layer at all, period. Number two, making sure that my naming conventions and my structure is correct for these different variables that are present. And then number three, making sure that the value associated with the variable is in the proper format and is what I would be expecting. Take, for example, for page type, if I'm on the home page, first thing I'm looking for, using page type as an example, first thing I'm looking for is page type on a particular page. Is it even there? Number two, is it formatted in the same way that I see right here? Camel case page type. And is it at the top level of my data layer object? Yes, yes it is. Number three, I want to make sure that if, for example, I'm on the home page, my page type isn't product page. Make sure that what is being pulled and what is being referenced is accurate to what is actually the case on the website. I'm going to do that for each of these different aspects and different parts of the data layer, and I'm going to note any issues that are present. So that's what documentation looks like. That's how I can work all the way back from my high level, just what are the requirements, what tags are there, working through in order to be able to define the requirements that I need within the data layer in order to satisfy and support the management of all of those different tags, as well as the documentation that I'm going to need to put together and or ideally just have so that we can now go through the process of actual testing and actual validation. Perfect. So at this point, we need to get our hands dirty, basically, and start actually testing. Now, the first way that I want to go through this process is how you would manually go about it. I think this always helps in order to be able to help you understand, one, how to just generally spot check, but two, really getting an understanding of how this is working and what it looks like. So, for accessing the data layer, we're going to use a website just because I know that they have a data layer defined. It's not someone that I actively work with, so no comments on what is actually contained within the data layer object. But how you're going to be able to see data layer. What is there? Is there even a data layer present at all? If so, what is contained within there? What you're going to do if you're using Chrome like I am, you can just right click on a page and click inspect. You can also open up this is what's called just your development console. What you can then do, you'll see different tabs here, and it's really the same pretty much regardless of the browser that you're using, but you can go to the console and you need to type in the name of the data layer object. Now, if your site or the site that you're taking a look at is using Google Tag Manager, by default, this is going to be named data layer, camel case, just as you saw you can see right here. That is how the data layer is defined. Now the name can be changed based upon what they're putting within their Google Tag Manager snippet and how they're defining it on the page. So it could be a little bit different, but general rule of thumb, I'd say 90% of websites that are using Google Tag Manager have a data layer defined as data layer. So what you'll see there is a bunch of objects. What you'll need to do is drop those down. So you can see now a bunch of objects, and you can start just dropping down each of these. Now, each of these objects represents, as you saw within that implementation guide, a data layer.push. What the developers are doing here is on the back end referencing those back end systems, content management system, e-commerce platform, pulling the data that they need and then putting it into their code and pushing that information to your the JavaScript object or the array, in this case, that is the data layer. So each of those pushes represents an individual object. So standard, in this case, again, using Google Tag Manager as the example, standard events that you're going to see are just timing events, gtm.js. You'll see a gtm.dom somewhere and then a gtm.load somewhere. But you'll also see any other information that they're pushing to the data layer. In this case, events, gtm page load, set I, whatever that is, set I, these various different events. And then the contextual information, dimension 189, dimension 176, dimension 186, that is being collected for those different events. So in your context, and tying this back to what it was, or the documentation and the testing process that we were just going through, you're going to have defined, as I showed that example of, exactly what should be here, the structure that it should be in. So if manually checking, you can just go through, drop down all these different objects and make sure that what you have defined is in fact there. And we can go through, work through that testing document, which was the last one that I had showed you, marking everything green. If yes, my variable's here, yes, my value is correct, yes, my nomenclature is correct, it's good to go. It's tested, we can move on to the next, go through the various different pages on the website as such, or again, if we're just spot checking, want to make sure that everything on a product page is actually, populating as expected. I can go to that product page, I can check this out. Simple. A couple important considerations to remember here as we're going through and doing any sort of manual testing or testing just in general. So number one, timing matters. Data must be available within the data layer in order to be used and leveraged by a tag. We see this all the time. I would say probably 60% of issues that I see when a client comes to us and says, hey, we're not collecting XYZ data point for this particular platform. Why is this happening? Obviously, you're going to go through and start looking, okay, is it there? Is there some sort of an issue with the tag firing? Nope. Is there some sort of an issue with that value being populated within the data layer? Nope. But is that tag executing before that data is available within the data layer object? Yep, it sure is. So we have to remember that the data has to be available by the time it's used. Let me actually, just because this is a very important point, come in here and explain this. So using, again, this site as an example. So the first event that we see here is gtm.js. Now, if you're familiar with Google Tag Manager, you know that one of the default timing events for tag to fire is, or one of the default triggers is page view or all pages. That all pages trigger is for it to fire on every single page on what within the user interface is considered the page view event. That page view maps to this gtm.js. So it's when this gtm.js event happens or is pushed to the data layer, that's when any tag with that particular trigger is going to be executed. So if I have a tag that is set to fire on page view or gtm.js, if I'm trying to pull in, say, this custom dimension, dimension 186, into a particular platform, it's not going to be collected. Now, everything within the data layer, all these objects are ordered and indexed as they are because this is the order in which these different pushes are happening, or when these objects are being sent to the data layer. So if my tag fires here, but this hasn't happened yet, I don't have dimension 186 available to be referenced within that particular tag. So keep that in mind, especially when going through and testing, because it's not enough just to be able to identify, okay, yep, this is here, and my data is there, my value is there. You also need to think through, okay, how, based on my tag architecture and how these tags are set up, is this maybe firing too soon? Do I need to delay it? Do I need to attach it to a different event in order to be able to have my data points available? A couple of additional considerations. Naming conventions, again, those do matter. Structure matters because anything that you're referencing within your tag management system to the data layer, it needs to match up. Again, variables and data layer structure. And then also for the type of site and any sort of persistent variables or values. As more and more sites start moving to newer frameworks for how they're built for purposes of one, it's the new flavor of the month, or two, potentially performance considerations, things like that. We're seeing a lot more sites move to the framework of being a single page application. And basically what a single page application is the page only loads one time in the traditional sense. And then there's just JavaScript that's changing the front end experience. So the page state changes, but it's not an actual refresh of the page. When a page doesn't reload in the traditional sense, your data layer is never cleared. So any information that's pushed to that particular object is going to persist until it is replaced, basically. And it's always going to be in that object. So we see a couple of different concerns here and considerations that you might want to think about. One, if you're never manually wiping out or clearing that data layer object, it can get rather large and just heavy from a weight perspective on the page. Needing more processing, needing more memory, taking a memory that could be used for other processes on the page, as well as potentially having certain variables, certain values there being referenced that you're not wanting them to be. So you need to keep that in mind when working with a single page application. There are some other caveats. We actually, on the InfoTrust side, just last week, had a webinar about some certain implications for analytics tracking when it comes to setting that up and doing so on a single page application website. So if you have more questions on that, let me know. We can always send over that recording and some notes and things from that webinar that might be able to help out. But it does also extend to how you're constructing, how you're testing, and what you're looking for when it comes to validating the data layer as well. Awesome. So we've gone through what the data layer is, documentation that you need for testing, documentation that you just should have in general, how to access, how to manually check the data layer, seeing what it looks like both in theory and in practice, and then some of those important considerations to keep in mind. Now I want to get into just what automated testing can look like, and then also some validation at scale. I know a lot of you are probably working with either multiple sites within your own organization, being maybe a multi-brand organization or a larger CPG sort of organization, or a situation where you are working at an agency and you have a number of clients, each with their own sites, and each that you're wanting to be able to validate and test in an automated fashion for. So how can we do this? A couple of different ways. One, we can set up our own kind of custom tag and data and reporting when it comes to a collection platform. And I'll explain that a little bit further here in a second. We can also use tools such as Tag Inspector in order to be able to automatically validate and monitor the data layer moving forward. And one thing just to keep in mind, and it's a huge, huge, huge reason to leverage a central data layer, regardless again of the tag management system or the tags that you have deployed, is because tag data and reporting, if everything is referencing the same object and the same data points, if there is an issue at the data layer, at the site, at the root level, you're going to be aware pretty quickly because you're going to be missing that data point across all platforms. One of the biggest things and one of the biggest reasons for monitoring and validation, and why I encourage everyone to do ongoing monitoring, is because there are some platforms that you're only pulling reporting from on, say, a monthly basis or quarterly, depending upon the length of a campaign, or just depending upon what exactly you're using that tool for. If you have some sort of a failure in data collection for just that one specific platform, you don't even realize until you go to pull those reports on that monthly or quarterly basis. And at that point, there's nothing you can do. All that data, it's gone. It was never collected. By referencing everything in one central place, you're going to be able to see these different sorts of issues in the tools that you're in every single day, and making one fix, just one fix to the data layer, if that's the root cause of the issue, is going to fix that problem for every single platform. So keep that in mind if you're trying to convince your organization to implement something like this. So automated testing, two different primary ways. Like I was mentioning, one, some sort of a collection engine. And what you can do here is send different events or data to a collection point in order to highlight errors. It takes a little bit of a development work, but basically within your tag management system, you would just be looking at individual variables, individual values, and if certain things are ever undefined or are not present within the data layer, aka they'd be undefined and as a variable within your tag management system, when those different sorts of things happen, you could send an event up to some sort of a collection place. We would always recommend using something that's not charged based upon a hit limit. If you're going to do something like this with the collection engine, free GA can be useful here because sampling for reporting doesn't matter. All you're looking for is specific events that would be sent in there. But one downside here, there is typically with any sort of a free solution, there's going to be a little bit of a lag in terms of the time that's going to take. And you're also going to need to be able to isolate the potential issues in order to be able to test them specifically. If you're trying to do holistic, comprehensive monitoring testing with this sort of approach, it's going to be a lot of custom work within the tag management system. So we don't always recommend it in those sorts of scenarios. But if you have a specific issue, you're missing transaction ID from the data layer, you're wanting to monitor just that specifically, you can set up this sort of approach within your tag management system to be able to automate that process. The other way for automation, and I won't go into specifics too deep, we'll have another webinar where we'll dig into testing the data layer, specifically leveraging Tag Inspector, but using a tool such as Tag Inspector for automated testing. With Tag Inspector, with our Tag Inspector real-time platform, it is live, real user monitoring. So as actual users go through the website, we can validate any global JavaScript variable that's on the page. That would include any sort of a data object, or in this case, your data layer. We can say that certain attributes are required to be present within that data layer object across every single page, as well as writing some custom rules in order to validate holistically everything that I was referencing earlier in terms of the values that are present, the structure, the nomenclature, all that, as well as values being present for all those different variables. So if you're looking at a very large deployment, trying to validate at scale in an automated fashion, especially for ongoing monitoring, I would encourage you to check out some of these tools that can definitely help you with that. Perfect. So that really wraps pretty much everything up that I wanted to cover here today. Just a quick summary to run through it again. Originally, we touched on what the data layer is, what it looks like, what are some of those key data points, went through the documentation necessary for testing and validation, how you can go about that audit process. We'll dig further into that audit process. We have before in the past. You can find some of those webinars on our website, but went through what that process can look like, as well as how to access and then monitor the data layer manually to give you a feel for what that looks like, how you can troubleshoot, some important considerations always to keep in mind, and then how you can go about automated testing. Now let's hop into any questions. It looks like we have a few. Very good question in regards to who would be the member of your team or of your organization that actually sets up the actual data layer. If it's a person housed in a web development team or if it is a marketing analytics team. The actual implementation of the of the data layer is going to be on the development team. The reason for this is one, they need to write code on the actual site in order to be able to make those data layer.push events happen, in order to be able to get define the data layer on the page, and two, push that information to it. But two, they're also going to need to be able to reference via API, in most cases, those different back-end systems in order to be able to grab the information necessary and then put that into their code for the actual data layer pushes. So that is development work. Now, the marketing analytics team, or a partner, that's one thing that on the InfoTrust side we help clients with, can help you in defining, as I had outlined there earlier in the webinar, outlining exactly what the data requirements are and what the actual architecture should look like. At that point, it gets handed over to the development team so they can reference all those things in the back end, get the information, surface the information necessary, and push it into the data layer. Now, the beauty of implementing a data layer, though, is that at that point, it can be handed back over to your marketing analytics team with a little bit of training on your tag management system, as well as a little bit of just upfront configuration of different variables and everything that maps directly to the data layer. That's where tag management can be handled by the marketing team. Just a little bit of training, a little bit of technical know-how, pretty base level. You can then start implementing tags yourself and inputting those different variables in there, because it takes very minimal, if any, really none, coding work. So that's the beauty of a tag management system in the data layer, is that it can really democratize that process. But yeah, the actual implementation of the actual data layer is handled by the development team. Cool. And it doesn't look like I have any other questions. As always, always encourage you, if something comes up, if there's a specific situation that you're running into or a specific question that you have, definitely please reach out to us. More than happy to help out in any way. Be on the lookout for our additional future webinars, and then as well as visit our Tag Inspector blog for past webinars. There's some more great content on the data layer, technical specifics about the data layer, getting into a little bit more of a deep dive around tag management, as well as many of you maybe have seen recently published a definitive guide to that overall tag management process that I briefly walked through here today that might be helpful in a lot of your processes. So let us know if we can help out in any way. Thank you all for joining us. We will be sending out a recording here in the next day or so, so be on the lookout for that. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you on future webinars here. Thank you all very much.